This is Antic, the Atari 8-Bit podcast. I'm Kay Savitz. This is the third in a series of interviews called Atari at the Science Fair, where I talk with people who used Atari 8-bit computers to create projects and enter them in science fairs. Today's interview was with Mark Knutsen, who wrote a star cluster simulation in the fourth programming language for his high school science fair. I found this blurb in the July 1986 edition of the Jersey Atari Computer Group newsletter. June meeting highlights: Mark Knutsen showed us his star cluster program in fourth that won a science fair prize for him. Mark's program demonstrates the interaction of four stars in two planes. Mark also discussed fourth in general. This interview took place on August 21st, 2021. Mark has also shared his program and the source code. Those links are in the show notes at ataripodcast.com.
Somehow I got interested in computers, even though there weren't a lot of them around when I was a kid. But my middle school in the small town in New Jersey that I grew up in, Roselle, had an TRS-80 that I got to play with. The eighth grade, which was housed in the high school of the one high school in our town, had a lab of Commodore PET computers. And somewhere around that time as well, got interested in owning my own and wound up owning an Atari. My friend James got one first. He was a year older than me. And at some point around 81 or 82, I think, Ataris appeared in the Crutchfield catalog. You know, Crutchfield, the vendor of audio-video equipment, still exists. Got into selling Atari computers at that time. And my friend James's family purchased one and went to his house, would bike across town to get to play with him on his Atari 400 machine. Really wanted one of my own. And thanks to my parents' good record keeping and my decent memory about really important dates in my life, I know that in January 1983, went with my dad to Crazy Eddie. Yes, the Crazy Eddie, whom you may have heard of even if you didn't grow up in the New York metro area, and bought an Atari 800, 48K. It was GTIA 800, so not one of the first ones, but one of the later ones. And I think I was savvy enough to know what I was getting and glad that I was getting a GTIA 800. So that'll give you an idea of how much of a nerd I was at the time.
Nice. And what did you start doing with it?
Playing games. Wanted to program, had dreamed about and thought a lot about and wrote a lot of sketches on graph paper when I was a kid and before I had access or much access at all to a computer. The TRS-80 had rudimentary graphics, you know, pretty blocky, and the pixels were not square, but there was special TRS-80 graph paper that you could get, and you could sketch on that if you were trying to design exactly what the screen is going to look like. And so, although I didn't know how I would do it, I knew that it would be cool if there could be a screen that looked like this, and so I would have fun sketching these things out. So I learned BASIC on the TRS-80. Didn't do anything terribly exciting on it, but that definitely sparked my interest. I think that once I had a machine of my own, it was very tempting to play games on it all the time, and motivate myself to code was a harder thing to do, but I still managed to do it a little bit. And the program we're going to talk about is proof of that. So it's nice to be able to look back and to see that I was a bit productive and wasn't just playing games all the time.
Sure. So most kids of our era doing programming were using BASIC.
That's right.
Or maybe assembly language or maybe Action or something. Forth was a less used language, especially for people of you know, our age. How did you get into programming Forth?
Well, that's tied to the Jersey Atari Computer Group. Okay. And you contacted me because you found a tiny little blurb in the JACG newsletter.
Yes.
I don't know how you do it, Kay, but I really appreciate your tenacity. here, and because it sparked in me the desire to get the computer running again, which is something I've been meaning to do for years. I brought my Ataris with me from apartment to apartment, and to this house that I now own, and set aside space intending to have desk space for the machine and stuff, but had not motivated myself to do that until you got in touch. And so I appreciate that so very much.
Oh, well, you're welcome. And you said you had you listened to this podcast, you were aware of
Yes,
the interviews, and yet I still
absolutely.
had to find you. So thanks.
I mean, you have interviewed the royalty of the business, the folks who were in the industry building the hardware and software that we enjoyed so much as kids. So I was just a kid who was playing with the machines at the time. I have so appreciated hearing from the luminaries of the industry and hearing all their stories. I used to wonder about, how was this done? What is that company like? How is it that a magazine like Creative Computing or Analog or Antic is produced? It's been just fun to hear all of that. Okay. There was a Atari users group that somehow I heard about that was meeting at Murray Hill Bell Labs, which wasn't but a half an hour drive from where I lived. And my dad was willing to take me there. I didn't know at the time that's the birthplace of the Unix operating system right there, and only put all of that together a little while later. But unsurprisingly, the folks who worked at Bell Labs and their friends and family and people who lived in the neighborhood, we're interested in personal computing, and some of them were Atari enthusiasts, and they had a vibrant user group for a good long time that had a really well-produced newsletter, a great monthly meeting. It was just wonderful to have that group of folks, mostly adults, to go and be with on a monthly basis, probably on a Saturday, if I recall correctly. And so eventually I got involved to the extent that I helped to run the bulletin board system after graduating high school and when I was underclassman in college. And the board went from running on a 8-bit to an ST. But one of the attendees at the JCG meetings was a guy named Don Forbes, and he was an evangelist really for the Forth programming language, and wound up writing prolifically about it, both in our newsletter, and he was published as, I believe, Ask Mr. Forth in Analog magazine. Maybe you've seen the articles. I think there was a precursor called Ask Sally Forth, and then he took over authorship, and he was Mr. Forth or Dr. Forth, one of the two. Mm-hmm. So he glommed onto me at one of these meetings and said, you should learn how to program in Forth, and got me a copy of Valforth or a copy of Figforth or something like that. And I know at the time that I was wrestling with what to do vis-a-vis getting decent performance out of the Atari, because BASIC is slow, assembly is hard. Forth felt like a nice middle of the road kind of a choice there. You could get away from line numbers and go-to statements, but didn't have to dig into the complexity and the minutia of assembly language programming, which frankly scared me and still does. So it was at his prompting that I got into Forth, and it felt special. It felt like being part of an exclusive club, to be working in something a little bit more esoteric than that. But also the Valforth documentation, which I have a legit copy of, I think it was either given to me by Don or ordered a copy, is fantastic. And anybody who was interested in learning Forth could do worse than reading their documentation. I was looking at it again, of course, recently, glad to find a copy on archive.org as well. And they did such a good job describing how everything worked. It was just a joy to take a look at again.
Nice. So you decided to write a program called Star Cluster that you entered into a science fair. First of all, like, what science fair was it? What grade or whatever, and how did it do?
Roselle is a lower middle class town in the middle of suburban New Jersey, where at the time even, and probably still, the minority of us who graduated from the high school went on to go to college, by way of example. And yet, I grew up very privileged to have been part of the leading edge of a gifted and talented program in our public school system. We had some teachers and parents who were really interested in seeing that kind of a program exist. And so my grade was like the first grade that it existed for. And as a result, I got special attention and introduction to kids who were smarter than me and had similar interests. And it was just a fantastic public high school experience that I had. I would have doubted my own memory about this science fair if not for that blurb in the newsletter, because I had the darndest time finding the materials related to it. And I think I'm fairly well organized, and I had my boxes of Atari paraphernalia and discs and magazines and things, but I had put the materials about the science fair in a separate box of academic stuff. And it was, of course, in the last place I looked, which is always where you find things, right?
Sure.
This would have been my senior year of high school. The comments and the code say coding began April 3rd, 86. Version 2 coding began May 31st, 86. The newsletter is from July, and it was reporting about the June meeting of the user group. Mark Knutsen showed us his star cluster program in 4th that won a science fair prize for him. Mark's program demonstrates the interaction of 4 stars in 2 planes. That must have been a nerve-wracking public speaking experience for me. But it's always good, of course, to be doing public speaking with a crowd that wants you to succeed. And
sure.
So I guess I was willing to do that. So as far as I can remember, my school system or the town had a science fair, which was an unusual thing. It may have been the first. I honestly don't remember many details about it, but it was my senior year of high school. It must have been right near the end of the school year there. I must have been bored, and or I needed to do something for an independent study class that I was taking, because I was allowed to study for the advanced placement exam, for example. We didn't have any AP courses in my high school, but I was allowed to self-study, and I took the AP exam and placed out of my freshman year of college computer science courses, which was a nice ego booster. So there was this, I had worked at the public library. I made some money as a library page for a number of years, which is how I believe that I made the money to help pay for the first Atari in '83. Either that or delivering newspapers. And I would read the computer recreations articles in Scientific American magazine, because at some point Martin Gardner's mathematical recreations column stopped in Scientific American, and A.K. Dewdney's computer recreations column started. And so in January of '86, there's this article about star clusters, and it's subtitled How Close Encounters with Star Clusters Are Achieved with a Computer Telescope. And it goes on to describe how you might encode the loops to compute first the force between n stars in 3D space, and then the accelerations for each that changes the velocity of each, and then updates the position of each. And then your challenge is how do you draw that on the screen? And I see here in the article that there is a follow-up, I guess a few months later. It can't have been too much later, right? Because I started this work by April. That was in essence a bug report that explained some of the things that were wrong about the January column, and also suggested some refinements to the algorithm. And I must have taken all of that to heart, because it looks like I coded something that took note of those reports and that refinement in what I wound up doing. So I have been trying, Kay, to get into the head of my 18-year-old self to figure out what I was up to here. And I think I did a pretty good job compared to what I remember. So I'm still trying to figure this code out. It's about 200 lines of forth. And Forth is generally programmed in screens of 1 kilobyte, or on the Atari, 512 bytes, half a K at a time, because it fits nicely on the screen. And it corresponds to sectors on the disk. And I believe you mentioned that you have played around a little bit with Forth, so you probably...
Yes, Forth keeps finding me this year. I've archived a bunch of different Forth projects, and this is the year of Forth for some reason.
Cool. I'm glad to help. I'm glad to be part of the year Forth. It's funny because I don't think that this program runs any faster than it would in BASIC, because it's so dependent on floating point. And as we know, the floating point on Atari and Atari BASIC is slow, but accurate. And so there you are. But it was sure fun to write that way. And it's a lot more readable, I think, than it would have been in BASIC. And so I was just having fun in that regard.
Nice. Do you know how you did in the science fair?
I must have won. Like I said, I would have doubted my own memory, except it seems that I also wrote a resume for myself, probably on the Atari, either using Atari Writer or Paperclip. I can't remember which. Mm-hmm. And from the dates, it would have been right around this time and just before going to college. And the very last thing listed on my other activities and awards on the last page of this says, won first place in 1986 Roselle Science Fair Physical Sciences category for a computer star cluster simulation. Now, doubtless, I was the only computer there at the science fair, and I suspect that I may have had an advantage because of that. Here's this kid with this computer showing this thing on the screen, and he says it's a star cluster simulator, and I won the award in that category. So I'm
cool. I guess we'll have to take your resume's word for it that you won first place.
I tend to believe myself only because I typed it out.
Nifty. Did you work on any other programs, any other big projects on your Atari that you programmed yourself?
I sent you, going backwards in time, since I'm thinking of it, I sent you video of this thing I called Multibounce, which was also a Forth program.
Oh,
that was just bouncing the pixels, an arbitrary number of them on the screen, diagonally, and they would bounce off one another and off the walls that you would either draw or that it would draw randomly for you. So that was fun. And what was fun about that was that I decided it should have a title screen. And so I had the splash screen with the stick letters Multibounce written out, except that the balls would produce the diagonal lines in the M and the N. And the code for that screen, I think, was fully as big as the rest of the program, if not larger, which I thought at the time was funny and probably representative of other splash screens of other programs as well.
Sure.
Prior to that, basic programming, I can remember doing a lot of music. A very simple basic program on the Atari would read a bunch of data statements, 4 numbers at a time to tell it, or 8 numbers at a time, right? What 4 notes to play and the duration of them. And maybe some special case number codes, like a negative number would flip it into a mode where you could change the volumes or the tempo or something like that. And I had piano lessons since age 8. And my friend James, who owned the Atari 400 before I did, also knew how to read music. And so you take some sheet music for something maybe that was learning to play on the piano and work out all the numbers and type them in and get the computer to play a song. So I believe I've got plenty of examples of those. It'd just be a matter of figuring out which ones I did and which ones my friend did. If there's some ragtime in there, some Scott Joplin, then that was probably me, for example. I bet you that I did the Chariots of Fire movie theme as well.
Nice. So after I contacted you and you decided to finally get the stuff off of old floppy disks, can you tell me a little bit about the process of moving it to modern media?
Yeah, well, I have you to thank for the almost $250 I've spent so far this year on this hobby, because I bought a FujiNet, which is a fantastic little device. I've got it on the 800 XL off camera here, and I have my old 800. I've got the 800 XL with a 256K memory mod in it that somebody from the computer group did for me, because I am a software guy, not a hardware guy, and so I've had to rely on friends who with soldering irons and knowledge of electronics. It's got a XL Boss chip in it with a switch that lets me switch between the XL Boss OS and the XL OS, which is great for backward compatibility. You don't need a translator floppy. You just turn on the XL Boss. Plus, it can cold boot the system without working the power switch, which is fun. And it will, like an 800, load up without BASIC by default, so you don't have to hold down the option key. So that's all nice to have. So I was able to figure out how to get the stuff onto the SD card by making disk images, and then copy over the disk images to the Mac here, and sent you a copy. And if it works for you, that's proof that it'll work for anybody.
Excellent. Are you going to put that stuff online for the world, or?
Sure. Yeah. I think what I'd like to do would be to make a self-contained thing, right? So I discovered what I had was a bootable Valforth disk that you make with a save command, I believe, and it just saves the complete environment that you have loaded. Because Valforth is all about libraries, and it comes with a software library for planar missile graphics and an editor and any number of other floating point package extensions for arrays of floating point numbers and that kind of thing, which I needed for my science fair project. And it takes a while to load all this stuff up, and you have to remember which libraries do you need, so you can save an image of that. And I believe I read on Archive that some of their other docs let you make a bootable disk, right? They would allow you to make commercial software, and there's a few programs out there that expressly say this was made with Valforth, because all they required was a notice. So I'd like to do something like that.
Tell me about being one of the sysops of the JACG BBS.
I can't remember specifics, like the name of the software that we used, but prior to my tenure, the BBS was run on 8-bit Ataris by a really smart guy who was the author of the BBS Construction Set, or the BBS Construction Kit. I forget his name, but he was a extremely smart guy, not all that much older than me. And so he took care of the whole thing and made it work for everybody. And he, of course, sold the BBS Construction Set commercially. But after his tenure, because he would have gone off to college again
Scott
before I did.
Brause, B-R-A-U-S-E.
Brause or Browsey.
Browse?
I'm not sure how it's pronounced either.
Yeah.
Sounds right, though, yes. So after Scott, we needed to figure out what to do. And I believe the club got in touch with a commercial publisher that had advertised an ST-based BBS. And we contacted them, and it turned out that it wasn't like ready yet, but they wanted beta testers. And so we were willing to be a beta test site if they would just give us the software. And so we did that. And a guy I knew, Gary from the JCG, housed the ST in his home. And I would help because he was not as interested in programming as I was, and just to get the thing up and running and keep it going. Check in on it periodically from college. I went to Rutgers University, maybe half an hour drive from where I grew up. And so it was easy for me to stop at home or to dial up the BBS, and it wasn't too expensive of a phone call at the time.
Nice. I found a very old post from you saying that you had the only Atari computer at Rutgers.
Probably, yeah. I got to attend the New Jersey Governor's School in the Sciences the summer after my junior year in high school, which was great because I got to meet fellow nerds, and a whole bunch of us went to Rutgers together. And so Rutgers, being a huge state school, was a scary prospect, but it was nice to know I was going to be in the honors program, and I already knew who my roommates were going to be because we paired up with some friends that I had known the prior summer. from the governor's school. And of course, unsurprisingly, I roomed with some fellow computer enthusiasts. And so if not freshman year, then sophomore, junior year, we had more computers in the dorm room than guys. And it was certainly the exception, not the rule at the time. This was well before internet, let alone global internet access. So was able to dial up the campus computer center from the dorm room and use the Atari. I had an ATR 8000 at the time as well, and 80-column terminal program. I was able to dial up the school and do work that way. Although it was still a lot better idea to go to the computer center and use the machines there.
Sure.
Roommate had a AT by way of comparison. I couldn't have afforded one.
What do you do these days?
I have been a software engineer my entire professional career. And indeed, it started back in around 6th or 7th grade. I was a computer science major from the get-go in college. Never considered another major, never changed majors. Very strange. Most people do. I interned at IBM a couple of summers during my college career, and then got my first job with IBM out of college. Was working with a group there where we were quite literally building out the internet in this country. IBM had the contract to build the custom routers that ran the NSF net. So the backbone of the internet in this country from the late 80s, early 90s, before it was commercialized, was run out of Michigan. The long distance lines were supplied by, I believe it was MCI, and the router hardware, which you couldn't buy commercially at the time, Cisco didn't make a router that was that fast, were custom built by the group that I worked with. I was in a testing capacity, based initially on a token ring of IBM PCRTs, which ran a variant of Unix. And each RT on the token ring would handle one T1 line and routed around the token ring to the RT that was running the routing daemon exclusively, and then around the token ring again to the RT that was handling the outgoing T1 line, and that's how the packets were routed. Later on, the backbone was increased to T3 speeds, a whopping 45 megabits a second, and which is, slower than what you can get for your personal home internet these days. And the entire concept was inside the microchannel bus of the RISC System 6000, IBM's Unix-based workstation with a microchannel bus. So the smart people I worked with did custom routing hardware so that every card on the microchannel bus was running its own RS-960 processor and a IP stack, and had enough memory to hold the entire routing table for the internet, and handled the traffic for the internet in this country, early 90s. From there, I went to work for the NASDAQ stock market. All of this was in suburban Connecticut. I like to say I spent my career avoiding working in New York City, and was surprised that I would get a chance to work for the stock market without having to actually commute to Wall Street, because the data center for the NASDAQ was in suburban Connecticut at the time. And working in a testing kind of a capacity, I fell into a role with a team where we were responsible for testing the stock market systems and making sure that they were able to handle the heaviest, busiest days of trading by pounding on them on the weekends until they broke, and then handing them to the development folks and saying, this is what we did and this is how it broke. And they would complain, that's unfair, it would never behave like that in real life. Well, it's very hard to predict what an IPO of Google, for example, may do to your stock market. So it was nice when that happened that we were indeed prepared for it. From there, I worked for a financial services company called FactSet, again, suburban Connecticut, and then moved down here to Florida to work for a Christian ministry called Crew, which had been my dream all along, to get to do what I do for a ministry. And so I've been here for 7 years.
Nice. So do you want to demonstrate Star Cluster?
Yes, it would be nice if I could, and if it would actually
Excellent.
work.
Well, I know you've had practice doing this because you did it at the JAC meeting.
Only
1980s.
35 years ago.
Right. So, right. You've had time to perfect this demonstration.
What I've done here, we may as well do a small Forth tutorial while we're at it, right? Forth is a stack-based language, so everything is in reverse Polish notation, kind of like the old HP calculators, or so I'm told. I never owned an old HP calculator. But you put stuff onto the stack, and then you do actions on the stuff that's on the stack that gets popped off in the opposite direction it came on. And so everything's backwards, and it's very confusing. Can you see my mouse pointer?
Yes.
I've already done the equivalent of a poke 82, 0 here. So that's making the text as wide as possible, making the columns narrow so that we can see the code nicely when we load it up. And then on Echo, it's going to show the things I loaded. So let's see if I can't. I had to remember that I had gone to Valdos and had stored this stuff not on screens or sectors on the floppy disk, but rather as regular old DOS files. So that was fun to figure out what I had been up to at the time. This is the actual speed at which it loads and compiles the code. So we can speed that up. So we're now running at 300 frames a second, which would be what, 5 times real time, right? And I've been trying to get into my own head and figure out what I was up to here. And I don't quite completely understand myself, but at least I commented things well. And so I have a chance of figuring it all out eventually. Why don't we go for broke from the get-go, huh? I'm going to load up 4 stars here. So what you see, and we may as well let this scroll by slowly so you can see that there's a bunch of 3D coordinates for star number 1, star number 2, star number 3, star number 4, scrolling by. And then according to my notes, we say initialize and just get this thing running. See what happens. Okay, so what you are seeing is 2 views into the 3D world, a square on the left and a square on the right, and the stars are in the 4 compass points on the left-hand side. So on the left here, x-axis is left and right, y is up and down as you would expect. The z-axis is pointing straight towards you. So you might think of yourself as looking straight down into the imaginary box that is the universe. And then if you were to kind of twist that view and look at it from the right-hand side, that's what the right-hand view is. It has the, let me see if I can remember this. It has the y-axis is going left and right, the z-axis is up and down, and the x-axis is pointing straight towards you. So on the right, you're seeing kind of the height, as it were, of each of these stars. And so the one that started in the north is the highest, and then going counterclockwise, the one that started on the west is the next highest. The one that started in the south is the next highest, and the lowest one is the one that started on the east. And they're all kind of beginning to spin in a counterclockwise direction. Now I forget what relative masses and velocities I gave to them, but they do not stay nice and symmetrical. So let's speed this up because we need whatever speed we can get to be sure. And as it runs, I'll point out on the bottom, it's showing 2 numbers. dt is delta time and et is elapsed time. And the interesting thing here is that the dt is changing. So you can see it's slowly going down. It's 1.7, 1.6, 1.5 to the -3. And that's because it's dynamically changing the flow of time or the clock. It's not ticking a fixed clock, but rather it's slowing down time to get more accurate as the stars get closer to one another, because that's the point at which Dudney in his article explains that you would tend to get inaccurate, and they would slingshot around one another, and one of them would get some unfair inertia. It would get some unfair energy that it doesn't deserve, or that it doesn't get to pay back, the way he put it. So what this is trying to do is to mitigate against that by dynamically deciding what the next clock tick is going to be. Should it be a little bit shorter than the last time? And if things get farther apart, then it will make DT larger. So I've left this running overnight at normal speed or at warp speed here, and it's just fun to see what it comes up with by the end of several hours, as the stars either shoot off into space, spiral around one another. Mm-hmm. It's just a great treat to be able to have it running at better than the Atari's old clock speed, because this is pretty darn slow.
Sure. And you said you had found a bug where if things hit the edge of the screen, it just continually draws them at the edge of the screen?
No, that was intentional.
Was it?
I have it. Yeah, I intentionally made it plot along the edge if it was actually over the edge, just to show you that it was something was still going on. And sometimes the star would return back to the screen. So I thought that was a useful kind of a thing. If I were to attack this problem again, I think I might go for graphics 7, so I could make each of them a different color, and you could kind of distinguish between them. I'd also love it if we could get Atari 800 Mac X to run faster than it's willing to here. I've got a little monitor program. This is called iPulse for the Mac, and you can see here that if we ignore Zoom, which is a big CPU hog, Atari 800 Mac X here is only using about, what, 12% of the CPU?
Right.
So it'd be willing to go much faster, but if you dive into the source code on GitHub, you'll see that it's intentionally capped here at 300 frames a second.
You know, I've often wished that it was a variable speed, and it never occurred to me to submit a feature request on that, but I'm glad that you've done that.
Yes, I have emailed the author and asked him, would he be willing to give me a special build? If not, make it variable. The comments in the code make it obvious why he did that. If it were any faster, the key repeat would kick in so quickly you wouldn't be able to type on it.
But for things like this, you don't want to type. You just want it to.
That's what I told him in email. So I'm hoping he'll get back to me. I see that he is and has been on the community site, whose name slips my mind at the moment.
Nice. Do you have the Multibounce program around you can show us too?
I don't have that conveniently available to show, I'm afraid.
All right. Well, I hope that you post that as well, because that was a fun thing to watch. I'd like to play with that.
Sure, that one I know I intended to, because I put the little notice that on it that Valpar wanted you to put, saying, you know, this was built with Valforth, a product of Valpar International, etc.
Do you remember if back in the day you uploaded that to the BBS or anything?
I honestly don't recall. I may not have known at the time how to create a disk image. And I know I tried to submit something to a magazine. I can't remember if it was one of these or if it was a music program. But I remember doing a magazine submission and having it rejected, which disappointed me.
If you could send a message to the people who are still using their Atari computers today, apparently including yourself, and you can
I do that right now?
You can do that right now. How did you know I was going to say that? What would you tell them?
I think I would just echo what I have heard so many of your other interviewees say, and that would be two things, really. Just a huge amount of gratitude to a lot of your interviewees who were, you know, older than us and built the industry and produced these fun toys for us to play with as kids. That really sparked, I know, for me, and I believe for you as well, an entire career. Correct?
Absolutely.
And then, but an equal amount of gratitude to yourself and to the others who keep the community going and who have archived so much of the software and hardware and magazines, and enabled the hobby to continue. It's just thrilling to me to know that I have a decent chance at being able to preserve the software that I have, that, you know, I may have written myself or that has not already been preserved. It's a fantastic thing. So I have gotten myself an account on, is it Atari Age? What's the name of the forum?
Mm-hmm.
I'm Knutsen there at Atari Age. So I'm certainly going to be hoping for the help and the good graces, especially of a hardware expert somewhere near me in the Central Florida region, because eventually, the floppy drive or the Atari is going to need service. And like I said, I'm a software guy, not a hardware guy.
I'm in the same boat. I'm in the mercy of the hardware people, but but there are plenty of them.
And I have always found them to be friendly and very helpful, which was, how I got my 256K upgrade and my Boss XL with the switch on the 800 XL over here. And, somebody at the club sold me the ATR 8000 and floppy drives for that. So I could play a little bit with CPM and with using it as a peripheral adapter. It was just, the Jersey Atari Computer Group was a wonderful bunch of people and a great forum for interesting a young guy like me in a career in computer science. Back at the beginning of the industry, the personal computing industry, when you really had to go looking for help if you were interested in playing with computers at home.
Thank you so much, Mark.
My pleasure. Thank you.
If you enjoy these interviews and would like to contribute something, there are 2 ways you can help. I encourage you to donate to one of our favorite organizations, the Internet Archive, at archive.org. The Internet Archive is a nonprofit digital library with the stated mission of universal access to all knowledge. They've done incredible things to preserve computer history, including hosting thousands of programs in an in-browser Atari emulator. They also created the Wayback Machine and offer full-page scans of countless Atari computer books and magazines. You can make your tax-deductible contribution at archive.org/donate. Or if you prefer, you can contribute to my Patreon at patreon.com/Savitz, which helps reimburse me for the time and expenses of creating these interviews. Thanks.